All right. Hi, everybody. This is Barry, co-founder and CEO at Ivy. And I'm super excited to have here with us David Benjamin. Hi, David. How are you?
Hi, Barry. I'm doing great.
So glad that you're here. To give everybody a little bit of context, so our mission at Ivy is to help leaders accelerate their careers and their impact. And the way we do that oftentimes is to learn from the leading minds of our time. And today, we're going to be talking about how to quickly solve any complex challenge. So there's not a person under the sun that wouldn't benefit from this conversation, but especially Ivy members, whether you're leading your organization or helping transform it and get it to the next level. Working through complexity is a critical skill to have. And it's something that if we're CEOs, we can implement directly, but even if we're not, we can really push our organizations to get to that level. David is an ideal person to be learning from when it comes to the subject. I can't actually think of anyone better. To give you a little bit of background on him, he is the co-founder of Syntegrity, which has come up with the complexity formula that we're going to be learning about, and the origins of which is from cybernetics, systems thinking, and has been refined over 2 decades of David's working with CEOs of Fortune 500 companies, policymakers, global product leaders, government officials, and heads of global associations. So most Ivy members fit into one of those buckets, and we're very, very lucky to have David here with us. So David, why don't you maybe start with sharing with us what got you to launch your company in the first place and eventually publish your most recent book?
Well, in terms of launching the company, I was shown an approach to dealing with something complex, and basically what we're doing is an evolution of that over many years of using it. And I've got a math and computer science background. So underpinning this kind of human process that I was being shown were optimal models for connecting people and some really interesting things like eigenvectors that describe how many times you need to iterate through things in order to get to answers and those kinds of things. So it really appealed to me. And I more or less gave notice of what I was working on, where I was working, that I was leaving, and was at it the next Monday. In terms of the writing of the book, we've been basically writing this book since the beginning of the company, as we've learned a lot about different kinds of challenges, different kinds of groups, and different kinds of organizations, and how how we can help them go from the way that they normally approach some of their biggest challenges to a new way that really embraces the talent that's in and around the ecosystem, as opposed to outsourcing it to someone else to solve. And I'll talk more later about the byproduct of that, but there's a little bit of a sense of obligation, knowing that it can be done that way much faster, with much less expense, and with much greater uptake. There really is a sense of obligation here as well to get the word out to the world.
Excellent. Well, we really appreciate you, not just for the great work you do with your company and also crystallizing all those learnings in the book, but also spending an hour here with us today. So my goal for this conversation is that at the end of this hour, we will be really well armed with practical, actionable ways in which we can much better navigate complex situations and complex challenges. In order for us to be able to do that, I believe the best place to start is even defining what is complexity, because every single person who's watching this now, listening to this now, they're all thinking about some scenario where this might apply. And what's also interesting is your math background. You were like doing mathematical models around this kind of stuff, but you're also an entrepreneur, and you know that in business, so much is in the gray, and you don't have all the tidy numbers and data sets and so forth. A lot of it is also intuitive. So would love for you to define for us, what's complexity? How is that just different from complicated things? So that then we all have the right mindset to tackle and dive into the subject further.
Okay, great. And when I do learning sessions on this with executives or boards, I do a little exercise at the beginning where I ask them all to sort of sit and reflect on a challenge that's keeping them up at night. And usually when you're talking about something that's keeping you up at night, that's probably going to be a complex challenge. But what I then do is have people sort of share with the group the challenge that they wrote down. And I give them little voting cards. One side says complicated and one side says complex. And I don't define anything for them yet. I just ask them, after hearing each challenge, Was that complicated or complex? And what's amazing is how people have no idea even how they personally define the difference between the two. So for us, in terms of articulating what we do, it's really important for us to latch onto a definition that's clear and consistent. So something that's complicated is basically a solved problem. It has been solved, it can be solved, it's deterministic. There is an expert out there who can apply a known solution, follow a checklist of things that they do and get to a solution. So that's complicated. And a good example of that is fixing a car. It doesn't mean I can fix a car, but it does mean that there's somebody out there who can fix my car just about no matter what's wrong with it. So if you contrast that with something that's complex, it's not deterministic. There are many moving parts. There are interdependencies that you can't anticipate. Things change dynamically. And the relationship between things is as important as the things themselves. And so because of that, there is no known solution that can just be taken off a shelf and applied. There is no expert who has solved your problem before, because your complex problem is different because it's your organization, it's 2019, it's whatever geography you're in, which by definition makes the dynamics different. There's a different ecosystem involved, there's different people, there's different employment dynamics and customer expectations and everything else. So that's complex. So growing a business, really hardcore strategy, dealing with a pandemic flu epidemic, trying to make your city a better place to live. Those are all complex challenges.
All right, got it. So essentially, whatever's keeping you up at night and whatever doesn't have a blatantly like a fixed solution, whether or not you can fix it, if it's a very dynamic problem, you don't know what the outcome is going to be when you move one piece and so forth. That's the definition of complex. And why is it that, why is there a need for what you do? Because obviously complex problems, like the way you're defining it almost makes it sound like, well, if it was, if there's either complicated ones that already have a fixer, but complex ones, they don't have that clear solution. How come then people hire you and your firm? What is the big challenge that they're facing in making complex decisions? What's the need on the market?
Yeah, I think without those definitions in hand, it's easy to confuse, a big software project with something that's complex. So if you have success with a company that's helped you roll out an ERP system internally or something like that, you might then conclude that that same company can help you with your strategy because they're really good at managing big projects. But the difference, again, roughly speaking, is that if you're rolling out an ERP system or anything else, you're dealing with something complicated. There is an approach, a checklisted, do this, do this, do this, install that, configure this kind of approach that will get you to a solution. But to take a traditional consulting firm, for example, and say, now solve this complex problem for me, it's just the wrong approach. But it seems like, nobody's ever been fired for doing that. But in fact, I mean, the numbers are showing that there's much less satisfaction, much less success in terms specifically of execution of the solutions that come out of that approach. So leaders tend to, lean on what's worked for them in the past. The approach that we're talking about starts with a little bit of vulnerability and acceptance that, you and your executive team don't know the answers. And that's an initial impediment to doing it the way we're talking about. And it's not easy. It's not easy, and it's not apparent, and it's not, you weren't taught this in business school, to know what to do with something that's complex. So again, with time pressure and lots at stake, you try something, even if it's kicking it down the road a bit, to show progress.
Absolutely. That's great. So I want to dive into the complexity formula, but before we do, one quick question.
Yeah.
What is it that people get wrong most of the time? So before we go into, kind of your prescription of how to approach a complex problem, could you tell us what are the biggest pitfalls people make so that all of us can also identify, okay, what's even causing the problem in the first place? You already started mentioning vulnerability, but what are the general big mistakes that you see that companies make time and again?
Well, let me just start with a metaphor. And if you've heard us speak before, you probably heard the metaphor, so I apologize. But let's say you walk into your office one morning and open your door. If you're wearing a hat, you hang your hat on the hook and you look up and there's a lion, a ferocious lion sitting on your desk, licking its chops, right? What do? Well, if you're most people, what you do is slam the door and run the other way. But what actually happened in that time is that you were able to sense that there's a lion there. You were able to absorb the implications of a ferocious lion on your desk and the threat to you. You were able to think about the implications of that, make a decision, and act in the blink of an eye. So that's great because you are an integrated operating system that can do all of those functions very quickly and get to action. Organizations are not that way at all. So one of the mistakes that organizations make is that they've kind of siloed out the sensors, the absorbers, the thinkers, the deciders, and the actors. And it becomes almost a linear process of picking up the stimulus of a threat or opportunity in the market, getting that to the people who are going to analyze it and talk about options, getting that to the people who are going to make decisions, and then handing that over to another group of people who are going to act. And if you think about it, that does not get you to action very fast, and there's a lot of room for broken telephone. So, you know, even to just start to bring those people together, all in the room, all at once, to talk about a threat like Amazon or whatever it is that's changing the situation, changing the game for you, that's just not something that leaders easily do. Second thing is they go after problem solving without getting a really good handle on the problem that they're trying to solve. And you can watch people thinking that they're talking about the same things, but being defied by the language they use, and really like just missing each other's point and not really getting to clarity on even what they're trying to solve. And the third thing I'd call out is that because complexity and complex challenges are so high stakes often and moving so quickly, there's a rush to action. And what gets missed in that rush to action is spending time to reach a shared understanding. And without a shared understanding, again, you're not solving the same problem. You're not aligned on what has to happen. You're not all doing the same things. And really, you're not ready to solve.
Thank you so much. It's a very powerful metaphor that you began with. So my key takeaway from what you said is that if you can get your organization or team or whatever you're responsible for, if you can get that group of people to react the way you would to a lion sitting on your desk, so that unified way, integrated machine where you're just like reacting and you know kind of what to do. Whereas when it's distributed into these siloed departments where different sensors are in different places, and even when you take action, people might not, like some people might think you're going out the door, some out the window, and that unity might not be there. So I guess everything we're going to cover from here onwards in the conversation is your proposal solutions, like what you found works really well in enabling people to overcome these challenges.
Yeah, and actually, let me just stop you there for a minute. So it's not the case that organizations can like change their structure so that the sensors, absorbers, thinkers, decide are always side by side working on things. People have different jobs, and there is a current course and speed trajectory to any organization. The question is, what do you do when it becomes apparent to leadership that current course and speed is not going to get you to what you're trying to achieve, whether that's a goal or whether that's remaining in business, for example? What do you do at those defining moments where it becomes apparent to leadership that current course and speed isn't going to cut it? So at those defining moments, that's when you got to get everyone in the room together. And we'll talk about this in a moment, I think, when we talk a bit more about variety. But getting people for a very brief amount of time aligned and mobilized around what the change is, what the challenge is, what we need to do, and who's going to do what, and then off to the races again. That's how you shift from one trajectory to another in an effective blink of the eye relative to how people normally go about that.
I love that, and it can resonate deeply with those moments, both in my personal life, but also in like the most inspiring points in history and so forth. It's usually how people deal with those situations. So you already gave us little insights into what it means. So what we're looking to do is just like, how to implement like an intervention that aligns people and, gets them in the right mindset when it's clear that the current course and trajectory isn't going to get you to where you want to be. So complexity formula. Could you walk us through how this framework works? Obviously we have, I'm sure this is something you've written a book about and it's a complicated topic, but just a high level, like how do you propose that people keep a framework in mind when they're looking at a complex situation like this?
Yeah, and what I'll try not to do is what my daughter does when I ask her, what was that book about? She reads the whole book to me and can't synopsize. So let me keep it very top line. First of all, there's the recognition that you're facing something complex. So step one is really, important and maybe seems obvious, but getting a leader or a person in the organization who owns a challenge of any type to recognize that there is no known solution. I'm not smart enough to figure this out on my own. My small team around me isn't smart enough to figure it out on its own. Acknowledge that I'm facing something complex and approach it differently. That's what we talk about in terms of a step one. I'll highlight a couple of the other steps in the formula. There's 10 and I'll try to give you 4. Second step is probably very, very, again, feeling a little bit obvious and trite, but really important. It's actually about making sure that you've articulated what the problem is, what the challenge is, and specifically in the form of a question, so that you can invite a really open, frank conversation that will get you to answers. Okay, and just the discipline to be able to sit down and write a good question, and I can get into what that means, but I won't do that now. But to really lay that out and articulate what the challenge is, and then get a small team of people vetting it and agreeing that that's the right challenge. Not easy and really important, because again, that's the starting point. Then having identified the challenge statement, the question, probably the defining moment in terms of your success is identifying, in terms of your success in using this approach, is identifying what the right variety of people is who collectively are needed in order to crack the code on the challenge. So again, we offer kind of tools and tables, and this was the fun part of writing the book, is really articulating all that stuff, getting very specific about how to think about who you need there. And it's completely contrary to how think tanks and executive teams and project teams are set up normally. It's a really rigorous think through of all of the dimensions of the challenge you're facing and who in the organization needs to be represented, what functions, what hierarchy levels, what geographies, and then what personality types and what demographics, what levels of stake, and so on and so on and so on, collectively would have something important to contribute to answers. Okay, so that's kind of step 3. Then again, I'm skipping ahead a few steps. You've now got a good collection of people, a good mix of people, and we tell you got to get them in one place. We still are not technologically there yet, where people can perform as effectively on this kind of thinking challenge, thinking together, if they're not face-to-face. So get them together, and now you've got a collection of people. And if you think about baking a cake, right? That collection of people right now is basically akin to the bowl of ingredients. And even mixed, you've still just got a combination of people. You still just got a bowl of ingredients. So what you have to do is you have to actually activate a chemical reaction. If you're baking a cake, that's put in the oven, apply heat. When you've got this assembly of people, we use collisions as kind of the method of action, as the activator, as the force that's going to drive that group to new and better results. So there's a bunch of things that go into those collisions. Things like behavioral roles that are assigned to people and iterations, so they're encountering everyone. But most importantly, not just kind of putting them around a boardroom table or sitting them in plenary to be talked at, connecting them directly with each other as opposed to being interviewed, letting them have really strong and powerful conversations several times over on the things that matter most to them with respect to the challenge you're asking them to solve.
Excellent. Thank you so much, David. So what I'd like to do is you outline these 4 steps, this abridged 4 steps. I want to take 5 minutes and I want to dive deeper into each of the steps so that we can take this, the high level outline you gave us and know what can we actually practically do to make these things happen. So the first step, getting a leader to recognize that, there is no known solution, that this is a complex problem. Could you just share, if you're the leader, what questions can you ask yourself to get there? But also, if you're not the actual person in charge, how do you get that leader to see that, hey, this is like a situation that warrants this approach, this formula?
It basically comes down to that definition I gave you earlier about complexity versus complicated challenges. Um, could I possibly write a list of steps that would get me to an answer? No. So must be complex. Is there an expert I know who has solved this challenge before? And really key is if I was to ask someone who I perceive to be an expert to come in and solve this, would they offer me a fixed price solution because they know just how long it's going to take and just what's involved? Or are they going to go time and materials? Because again, they have no idea really at the beginning what this is going to entail. Those kinds of things kind of position you to say, okay, this is complex. I think most people know if you do a gut check on the things that you're lying awake at night thinking about. I don't think you're lying awake at night wondering if your car is going to be fixed well by the mechanic that you've given the car to overnight. But how are we going to grow this company? How are we going to deal with that new legislation? And boy, are our customers ever at risk, as we implement anti-money laundering steps in the banks and suddenly they're being treated like strangers? Those kinds of things, they just eat at you. And, if that's happening, you're dealing with something complex.
All right, excellent. And then the second step you mentioned is defining the question. And one of our members, actually, Vinay, said he was reminded by the Einstein quote on, if he was given an hour to solve a problem, spend 30 minutes analyzing it, 20 minutes planning solution, 10 minutes for executing. Coming up with that key core question, what is the decision point? What is the key thing you're trying to solve? Any kind of helpful suggestions on how to define the question itself? What does a good question look like, and what does a not so good one look like?
Well, a not so good question is going to be biased and non-specific and uninteresting to the people you're asking the question of. So flip that on its head. A good question will give boundaries to the challenge, whatever that means, some sort of scope, without introducing unnecessary bias. So sometimes you have to pack in a few givens, because again, part of the boundary is I don't want you thinking about what we would do with unlimited budget, for example. But just enough to get people a good sense of what the guardrails are around what you're trying to solve. It should call for action, should be an action-oriented question. We always have a clause in the question that's something like, and what must we do over the next 6 months? So that's a third kind of qualifier for a good question, is some sort of specific time horizon, and often a time horizon for the plan you're looking for and a time horizon for the goal you're trying to achieve. So again, goal is another of those things, getting a very specific goal stated in your question. And I think this is where it gets interesting is we'll often challenge leaders who are thinking about what their question is to really try to make the goal uncomfortable. It's got to be a stretch of some sort. It's got to be reasonable. People can reasonably believe that it's achievable, but not current course and speed. So something that is ambitious, has some stretch to it, is an important goal to articulate. And just getting that right is often several meetings over with an executive team. That's too much, that's not enough. And we've had people afterwards say, I wish we had set the bar higher in terms of the goal statement, because it was too easy for people to just think within the box about how to hit those numbers. And then I would say the last thing that I really call out as an important characteristic is it should be interesting. It should be challenging. It might be a little insulting. Whatever it is, if people are comfortable with it, then it's probably not a good question, and you're probably going to get same old as they discuss it.
What's been a killer one that we can that exemplifies what you just mentioned?
I've got a few questions here that I wanted to offer up. So what must we do starting now and over the next 12 to 18 months to grow earnings by 300% over the next 4 years? And believe me, that was an enormous stretch. While continue to be a great company to work with and for. So to try to hit a really big stretch target without burning people out and having them dust off their resumes and leave, that's a lot of tension to pack into a question.
And plus, you set a clear goal for the 300% growth. You also set a constraint on the timeline within 4 years. So I guess while also not burning out the team. So actually, the whole thing is about here's what we want to do while keeping these constants that that we want to make sure we keep to. That was a great
Right.
one.
There's got to be some tension in there. One of my favorite kind of preambles to a question, I forget the exact situation, but it started with, what must we do despite ourselves to ... right? So just being vulnerable as a leader, writing a question like that and telling your organization, I know we're flawed, it's very powerful.
Okay, excellent. Last thing I want to ask on this is, especially for entrepreneurs and founders, but also for many CEOs, because like they're in it all the time, they're thinking about it all the time, they can just do this exercise, quote unquote, alone, right? Like come up with something like a straw man or a hypothesis, because when you just go and say, hey, let's define a question together with a whole group of people, for some CEOs, myself included, that's very uncomfortable actually, because you want to kind of go in with like you've already thought about something. Maybe that's wrong, but maybe it's not wrong. Just wanted you to kind of answer that, because a lot of pushback I often get, and I've heard other CEOs get, is like, or either, hey, Barry, you haven't thought this through, what you're suggesting, or, oh, you've already decided what you want to do. So you're just like now talking to us, right, just to, kind of check the boxes. How do you avoid that? So how does a leader kind of explore this question together with people without it seeming like it's optional, like whether, like, let's say the earnings actually have to grow
right
by 2x, like it's not anyone's opinion or option. Like, how do you just create that sense of camaraderie and teamwork, like that it's a joint effort, as opposed to like, hey, I'm the boss, I decided, so,
Yeah, it's funny. Usually the kind of the bounding statements like 300% don't get a lot of pushback. In terms of, if the CEO or the board has said it's 300%, it's 300%. We have to get there. But sort of the style and the thinking that sometimes accidentally gets baked into the question. So I'll give you an example. A high-tech company was, their question started with like, how do we continue to leverage our legacy products while we ... And once they had sort of crafted that themselves, the executive team, and shared it with people from across the organization, people were going, this is why we are where we are, because we're making assumptions about what the market needs from us without, applying the customer lens. So shouldn't the question be, what do our customers need from us? And then what is the right product mix in order to deliver that for our customers? So I'm not saying that was a profound insight or anything, but it was that challenge of the rest of the organization, or representatives of them being invited into the process of writing the question, that really turned that question on its head.
All right, excellent. We've had a couple of requests for any place where people can find that question written out. I'm sure it's in the book. Yeah, it's in the book. All righty, so we will send a link out to it, and I think it's good to have examples to model.
I believe, we're Forbes contributors. We've been writing lots of articles. If you go to our website and look at the, I think it's press page, so crackingcomplexity.com/press or something like that, you'll see lots of articles and lots of examples of questions in those articles.
Excellent. Thank you so much, David. So quickly moving on to step 3. So, this challenge of who should be in the room. There's the inner circle, right? But then it can be a very insular and very politicized inner circle. But there's people who are often a lot closer to the customer that are not necessarily in the upper echelons. So how do you decide who should be in the room? And more importantly, like, how do you manage expectations around that, right? So yeah. Those on the inside or outside.
So those are good questions. So there's this thing called the law of requisite variety. It comes from system sciences. It says only variety destroys variety. Only variety destroys variety. So when you're dealing with something complex, there's a lot of moving parts. There's a lot of variety. There's a lot of interdependencies, interconnections that you can't detect. So the job of dealing with something complex is to bring a matching amount of variety to bear in terms of the people that you're going to apply to that challenge. So it's called the law of requisite variety, which is necessary and sufficient, right? So part of the task is thinking about who's necessary. The fun part of the task is then thinking about who's sufficient. In other words, who doesn't need to be there, and how can I optimize for the number of people while continuing to have the same amount of variety. So we offer sort of 12 zones and 13 characteristics to just help you think methodically through the question of what's the right variety for this challenge I'm facing. So the zones sort of start with the inside of your operation. You know, who represents the operation? What are the business units? What are the product lines? What are the geographies? What are the hierarchical levels? So on and so forth. So a lot of times that's where the thinking stops if you're not really thinking about requisite variety. And a lot of times, even that thinking just leads you to the usual suspects, the ones who are always involved in these things and are really good at this stuff. And that's, you know, one of those pitfalls that we were talking about earlier. But if you really challenge yourself to get an interesting mix of people from within the operation and apply the lens of demographics and personality types and those kinds of things, attitude, you know, having the cynics and the optimists and everyone in the mix, you get a more interesting list of people from inside the operations. Then you look outside, you look at the market and you think about who are my people in the field, who from marketing do I need there, what marketing partners do we have, who are the experts in the market that may have nothing to do with me but would bring something new into our conversation, and you know, who are our consulting partners, who are our tech partners. Just again, who's in the market with us, who's in the market, how do we understand the market? That's a very important second layer. And then to get you know, even more eclectic in the group, it's often really important to think about who are the one or two like real outsiders that I could bring in. Somebody from a comparable industry, or if I'm a drug company, we're talking about what's going on in the US, who from Europe has already launched this product and has had success, and those kinds of things. So really the outsiders, the ones who really have nothing to lose by calling our organization on its foibles and, you know, our wrong way of thinking about things. Who's going to call out the CEO if the CEO is wandering down the wrong path? Really, really important. And the final sort of within these zones, they're kind of clustered together. The final cluster of zones is really about the challenge itself. So who are the people who've been through this kind of challenge before? Who are the veterans? Who are the people who are going to be most affected by this challenge? And really, really importantly, who are the actors? Who are the people that are going to be on the implementation side once we figured out what needs to be done? Because when you leave the actors out of it, and they are handed a solution, they don't believe, they don't understand, they nod their head, but implementation never goes to plan.
Excellent. I think if there's like, you know, one thing to take away from all of this is that very powerful quote, only variety destroys variety. So if you have a multifaceted problem, you better have a multifaceted solution team. So that's perfect. Quick follow-up. How many people are too many people? And how many would you say is too few? Just to give us, obviously it all depends on what we're talking about, but generally where does it become, okay, this is like, it's basically an all hands meeting beyond a certain point. And when is it like, well, you're really kind of group thinking here because you've got too few people?
If you got a challenge where like a good, healthy application of requisite variety produces 42, 45, 48 people, you're kind of at the upper bound of dealing with this in one go. So I'd say upper bound, think sort of 45, 48, 42, that range. And again, really apply necessary and sufficient, because you can often replace 5 people with 1 person if you look at past jobs and you know, projects they've been in and those kinds of things. So really being, you know, rationing the number of seats you have and being very selective about who you include. Low end, if you've got sort of less than 15, 16 people, you're into something that, again, you can apply everything we're talking about, but chances are if it's that low, this thing isn't that complex. If you've really thought about all the moving parts and the different facets and everything else, and you end up with 12 people, it's not as big as you think it is. You can still apply a lot of what we talk about, but it's kind of low end complexity at that point.
Got it. Perfect. Got it.
No, I was just going to say, just to finish the thought on the high end, if you end up with 70 people or 100 people and 200 people, you're into several recursions of the solving exercise. And there's interesting ways to then take your question and you know, tighten the scope or make it about a specific region, for example, before you do global. so that you can then do, cascading sessions.
Got it. Just very, very briefly, if you have a small team, let's say you're in a startup company, let's say in an extreme example, let's say it's a 15-person company. In that case, whenever a complex problem is faced, would you have the whole team participate without overthinking it? Of course, there's also talking about external stakeholders and so forth.
Yeah.
But generally, let's say it's something that, would you rather have everybody participate or just like quote unquote the management tier, like of the
I would rather have everyone participate. I'd rather have administration sitting at the table with the CEO, partners for sure. And again, if you're at 15, I would find a way to get to 24 by really thinking creatively about who can help you from the outside.
Yeah, clients and vendors and stakeholders. Got it. Awesome. All right. With the remaining time we have, I want to do two things. One, anybody who has questions, please type them in the Q&A box that's at the center middle of the screen, and I will look to cover all of them that I receive. And while those are populating, David, I want to ask you, so the fourth step, and I think this is the one where, you've given us so many frameworks for how to get started. This is like how you make sure the ingredients make like a tasty, delicious, beautiful looking cake versus like, a bunch of chemicals lying around. So what are the key things that lead to like people colliding in the right way versus in a negative way? So I'm sure there's countless examples, but if you had to really distill, what are the most critical best practices to implement in this kind of a setting to make sure that people productively work towards a solution?
So shared interest. So again, the question and the people who've been convened to answer that question at a high level should all have a stake in the question and feel connected to it and passionate about it. But one of the things I didn't mention earlier that is actually really important is letting the group of people you've convened go from the question to a list of topics, as opposed to being handed a preset agenda. And there's a little adage about, if you preset an agenda, a good minute taker can write the minutes of the meeting before it happens, because agendas rig the outcome of meetings, or can. So you get the group to set their own agenda, and that builds topics of conversation that they believe are the most important things for them to discuss. Second thing to apply is the two pizza rule. And I don't know if you've heard this before, but basically it says that you can't have a productive conversation in a group that's too large to share two large pizzas. So you make sure that when you're doling out conversation rights or talking rights at any given time, there's no more than 8 or 9 people who are actively participating in the conversation. And the way you do that is you break whatever groups are discussing something into subgroups that are of the right size. And you do that through behavioral roles, which is another of the really key ways to cause chemical reactions. So you have some subgroup of the group be members, and they talk and they own the conversation. You give another subgroup the role of critic, and their job is specifically to offer constructive critique to the team at a couple of times during the meeting, listening at all the other times, but twice having the members stop talking, turning the floor over to the critics, and letting the critics tell the members one or two or three things that they could be doing better, whether they're talking about the wrong things or people are dominating or whatever. And one thing I'd say is an immediate takeaway for anyone who's listening is that you can apply a critic role in your meetings tomorrow. You can pull a couple people, have them pull back from the table, and just play the critic role, and you will find it changes the dynamics in the meeting right away. And those people who may think that they're being excluded from the conversation actually have a great deal of power because they're able to see things that nobody at the table can, and they can say it briefly, one or two things, and change the course of the meeting. So behavioral roles is another thing that characterizes the chemical reactions. Last one I'll make.
Quick pause there.
Yeah.
So you have members. These are the main people discussing. You have the critic role. Could be a person or could be a group. They interrupt twice. Any other behavioral roles that you found to be powerful to incorporate?
Well, believe it or not, the other role we use with larger groups is observers, because you have to break people down to these kind of 8 people at a time conversations. The observer role, I mean, it only works if it's fair, if everybody gets a chance to play each role an equal number of times. But when you're in that observer seat, you are not allowed to speak at all during the course of the meeting, which sounds kind of ridiculous. But when we've taken CEOs in particular, but any leadership team members and forced them to listen to a conversation that they'd normally dominate, and had them held back from speaking when it's, you know, not their turn to speak, which is during the entire course of the meeting, they will thank you afterwards, because they saw their people in action. They realize I'm not the only one who knows, you know, what needed to be said. My point of view was represented surprisingly well by other people, and they're forced to listen for a change. So member, critic, observer usually does the trick. I mentioned fairness in doling those things out, so that's important. But surprisingly, another thing that it blows my mind sometimes how much people thank us for this, but it's just the discipline of starting meetings on time, ending meetings on time, telling people we're 15 minutes in, let's pause here and go to the critics, and just running a meeting really effectively, capturing notes for people so that they don't have to be writing, they can be talking to each other. All those things get people to a new place. But the last ingredient is iteration. You can't solve complex challenges in only one conversation. You can't take a question, identify talent management as an important sub-theme, and then figure things out in a 1-hour meeting about talent management. You need iteration to get all the way through a topic. You also need iteration because people need time to change. They need time to get off their agendas. They need time to listen to each other and to learn, to gain that shared understanding. So iteration, and by the way, 3 iterations is exactly the right number of iterations that you would generally need.
Excellent. And could you help us now, like, let's say we follow all these steps and we're, you know, baking the cake and good collisions are happening in the, as far as a meeting goes. How do you bridge the gap between this constructive conversation? Let's say you have a group of people amped about the question that you formulated and amped about how that question can best be answered. You've had your 3 iterations, right? And there's the makings of an action plan, right? How do you maintain, you know, that kind of energy and coherence and crystallization? Like, all these people were in the room, they're all on the same page, but then as you disseminate it out to the organization, when it comes to execution, what are like the biggest pitfalls that like stops, even when all of this is done super well, that what stops it from, you know, kind of being a success? And how do you avoid it, you know, kind of not materializing the way you would? So I guess, what's the way of like integrating something into your organization where like the outputs of such meetings are actually like reinforced on a regular basis?
Well, like everything else, you know, the first part of my answer would be it all comes down to the people who've been involved. So again, in that list of zones and characteristics that I mentioned earlier, we include influence as a really important aspect. So you're choosing people who have a lot of credibility. You're choosing people who, you know, having been brought on board and having bought into what the right thing is to do, are going to act as advocates and champions and missionaries in recruiting other people to the cause. And so ultimately you get the right group of people, you get them jazzed, and other people just get excited because it's them. Then we do things like have subsets of that group, rather than the CEO going out and saying, here's the plan, here's the plan, here's the plan. We have subsets of that group going out to present the plan, you know, and the subset of the group has a nice cross section. Senior leader, field person, etc. And by the time they have spent a few days together figuring something out and arrived at a solution that they have co-emerged, you know, as opposed to co-created, it's come to them and they've had a moment of realization and a shared understanding that that's what has to happen. At that point, they're able to finish each other's sentences when they go describe it to other people. And that's very powerful for other people to see. So you can kind of spread that way and with a good communication plan. And sometimes what we need to do is kind of cascade the experience itself into the plant or into the branch or whatever it is, so that other people have a question like, how do we take this thing and apply it locally? Like, what's it mean for us to do this here?
Excellent. Our member Heather had the question, how much space do you provide between iterations?
So most of the time when we're doing what we do, and by the way, what we do, our application of the formula is called Syntegration. So if I lapse into calling it Syntegration, that's why. We'll spend 2 or 3 days together. An iteration, so we'll take the question, the first thing that a group will do is choose 6, 8, or 12 topics that they need to discuss to answer that. And I'm not going to get into why it's 6, 8, or 12. So each iteration involves 6, 8, or 12 topics that we're running through in sequence those 3 times. between iterations, which sometimes is an overnight and sometimes is an over lunch kind of time, we pull people together and we pull them out of the individual topics and have them look back at the overarching question. And for about an hour, or if it's with lunch, an hour and 45 minutes, they are talking about their progress towards answering the question. So after a first iteration, where really a lot of what's happened is information sharing and storytelling, people will almost always feel like they have not made any progress. And in fact, might be further behind because they're wrapping their heads around just how dysfunctional the organization is or whatever that is. A good exercise to kind of get the full lay of the land, ideally sleep on it, which is why sometimes we'll try to get to an evening at that point. That's kind of the focus of that round one. Round two, we will move people into ideation and trying to keep it as pure a brainstorm as possible. And that's because the pump's been primed with information and issue statements and opportunities. And now people are ready because they've been informed by all the topics. They're ready to start talking about what could solutions look like. But if they dig too deep on any one thing, they're cutting off their own opportunity to have something really cool emerge. So we try to keep it, very brainstormy, so that, again, after another between round session where they're finding out what happened everywhere, because not everyone can be in every room, then we're into round three, where the job is to make recommendations, make decisions about what should happen, and state action-based recommendations with timeframes and everything else that reflect what the group has decided has to be done.
Excellent. Thank you for that, David. One of the things that I think probably why some leaders really screwed us up, but also something that's like critically important, is it seems, you mentioned the need for vulnerability, but it seems like a very scary thing for the leader of the organization to step into this 2 to 3 day process potentially, where they don't even necessarily know the question, don't know what the solutions may be, don't know what the topics are. It's like a very organic thing. Mm-hmm. But still the onus at the end is going to be on the decision maker to be like, all right, well, you got to decide. So I just, again, example of one, but like, I would find it difficult to not have some kind of an idea or hypothesis of like what I think might need to happen. And unlike a lot of other people in the organization, the person at the top should theoretically, be closer to the person reacting to the lion, because they actually do have access to all the different areas of the business. So maybe you could just share a little bit more of like, how does the person in charge like go with this? Either like they kind of have an idea, but let the process play out anyway to see if they're, how do you keep it from like being really organic versus influenced, and, just the best practices there, because it does require tremendous vulnerability to just like go with it, not knowing what's going to come out on the other end.
Yeah, and we'll often get asked, should I be there? Like, won't I stifle things if I'm present? We will always tell a CEO, yes, you should be there, because the CEO and the executive team, and not all the executive team, because that's too much of one aspect of variety, but they do see things and they do have a perch that other people don't have in terms of the more holistic, longer term, strategic, mission driven, board driven kinds of things. So they have to be part of the variety. Having them let go as, usually dominant voice, the roles take care of that. So you put them in a critic chair for their first meeting and an observer chair for the second meeting, and then they're in the swing of things. And they're starting to really love not being on the net. And most leaders want that. Most leaders want to see their organization stepping up. So people are stepping up all around them, and they know it's okay, I can pull back a bit. But really importantly, we almost never grant decision authority to the group. The decision is reserved for an approval step that happens afterward once a proposed plan is created. So there's discussion authority, and there's a clear expectation setting that we're not making decisions here. There will be a subsequent step where we're sitting down. We will have been here. We will have co-created this with you. We will know the rationale behind things. It will be a fair decision-making process, but ultimately it comes down to funds and timing and resources. So we got to reserve the right to make those decisions. And, that makes it okay. That relieves some of that tension you're talking about.
Excellent, thank you. And given like the time of the year, we're approaching Thanksgiving, holidays, but most importantly, a brand new year, right? 2020. And some companies are very good about, they've already thought about what their 2020 plan should be back in the summer. But for some companies, especially if there's a lot of dynamic motion and things are happening in real time, like you said, a regulation change, a new customer, new competitor, something like that. What are some, like, what would you suggest as like something like a good near end of year exercise that could warrant something like this? Because sometimes you have a complex issue, right? That's new, but sometimes it's like, hey, we have to retain our customers better. As always, like nothing is new, but like we've just really got to step it up. What's like, if that was the approach of a key thing that's like always true for a company, is there, I guess my bigger question is like, sometimes there's things come up, so you do this reactively, but also does it make sense proactively to bake this in? And it's more of a state of the union and a, hey, how do we make our product better? How do we retain our customers better? Like the, or like, how do we increase our sales? Like the classic problems every business has.
Yeah, how do I take out cost? And not under pressure, but because it's the right thing to do, always be looking at. I wish I could tell you that, you know, half the time it's reactive, what we're being brought into, and half the time it's proactive. But it's not nearly half and half. Most times there's so many fires to be dealt with and so many defining moments, you know, that are in some way a threat or you know, a derailed project or whatever it is. To be in a position of strength where you're actually just kind of proactively trying to set a new agenda isn't nearly as common. And we do encounter those situations. And a great way to kind of, you know, you're saying kind of what's a good end of year exercise? And I think you can do this for yourself. First of all, like write down a question that would kind of stretch people's thinking about what next year could be, right? I know we're committed to try to do 10% growth. What would it take to do 15, right? Give them that question and get you know, a nice variety group of people together. Don't tell them what they're going to talk about. So there's a very simple version of an agenda setting exercise. We can just sit around a table and have people look at a question and brainstorm their own individual thoughts about what really matters in answering that question. Not like what are sub-questions, but what do I think? Get them writing those things down and then do a quick take-up around the table. Let people say, well, you know, I wrote this. And first of all, you'll notice that 7 people will have written the same thing. You grab those 7, you put them on a board and you give the cluster a label. You know, so we need a topic about talent management. What else we got? You go to the next one, and people are talking about finance and financial models and how budgets are set and you know, how objectives are changing too frequently. Okay, let's take that one and put it up there. You'll quickly find you've got a handful of topics. Those topics then represent things that matter to people in the room. And you can go straight into conversations on some of those things with different people playing the member role, the critic role, and just spend a good day together. You know, whether it's your leadership team or a small cross-section of the organization or the 15 people in your small entrepreneurial startup, you'll have great conversations, especially if you have critics. But just having like everyone invested in what the topics are, playing like new behavioral roles, trying those things on, it'll change the dynamic very quickly.
Excellent. So you get people around the table, ask a really pointed question that gets them to like imagine a stretch scenario. Like, what if we had to be twice as profitable next year, you know, or whatever it may be. Let them actually give them time to write down their answer. How long would you give them to do that?
It takes about 5 or 10 minutes for people to write down
so
5 or 6 things. Yeah, very quick.
And then you group them together, and then that basically gives you the agenda of what you should probably be discussing, given like that's top of mind for, those are the things that are top of mind for people.
Yeah, and that's by no means the formula, but it's a way of just doing the question thing and a little bit of variety and, you know, setting your own agenda and like having conversations instead of I'm going to tell you or you're going to tell me or we're going to take turns taking the altar and talking at everyone else, just conversations.
Excellent. A couple of quick questions from members. So Layla asked, if you start without an agenda, how do you at least give them some idea of what they'll be brainstorming so they have some pre-prep, or is that against the concept?
You give them a question, you give them the question ahead of time so they know the context. And usually we'll have 3 or 4 or 5 objectives that articulate any specific things that, you know, the leadership team thinks they want done as a result of getting people together.
Okay,
and that's
so
enough.
A question, and then the objectives.
Yeah, and then pre-reads. You might need to give some level setting pre-reads. People don't read pre-reads, so we're always telling people, keep it to 1 or 2 pages or 1 or 2 slides or something like that. Maybe an opening presentation, again, just to make sure people have heard the level setting information. And the reason it's level setting, there's this great, I've lost the word, the cost of codification. When you do variety, and you bring in people who don't normally work together and have different jobs, different functions, etc., they do not speak the same language. So an engineer can say in a word to a room full of engineers paragraphs worth of information in a single word. But when they're in a larger group, people who aren't engineers, they have to spend paragraphs explaining every word that they're saying, right? So it really slows people down. So you do need to level set. You need to kind of find the basic terminology that's going to advance that. But the reason you need 3 iterations is because people need an entire iteration to just get to common language and to just start to understand each other's positions. So that's another, just take that away. Don't pretend that when you're bringing a high variety group together for a meeting that they're immediately talking about the same things, because they're not.
Got it. We may all be speaking English, but we may actually be saying very different things. So it's like the whole, like a third of the whole thing is just getting on the same page, it sounds like. Excellent. We've only got 2 minutes left. So what I want to do to wrap up, David, first, obviously, to thank you so much, and thanks to all the members who delved into this very important conversation. I think this is like the definition of making a positive impact, is if we can all improve by 10 to 20% how we structure these things, it can actually make orders of magnitude difference to the outcome. So thank you for that, David. What I want to ask you is, one, how can we best support your endeavors if people want to engage with your works, your content, but also with your firm? What's the best way to do that? And any final calls to action you would leave all of us with? So if we want us to remember just one more thing about our conversation today, what would that be?
Yeah, and again, we wrote a book, crackingcomplexity.com is your doorway to the book. You can buy it on Amazon and everything. But again, like I don't ever want to feel like I'm selling you a book, because I know people consume information in different ways. Feel free to go check out crackingcomplexity.com/press. And we have, I'm very proud of the stuff we've been writing. And I think it keeps getting better and better. So pick a topic and read through that. The business is called Syntegrity. So Syntegrity, Syntegrity group.com is the website. You'll see case studies and you get a little bit more of an understanding, but not a complete understanding of how Syntegration works. And you should reach out and contact the company if you have questions. This is stuff that works. We've been doing this for a long time. You'll see a list of client companies on the website, on the corporate website. It's really amazing. We're working top of the house on biggest challenges for Fortune 500, Fortune 50 organizations. I am not the kind of person who would put in a book something that doesn't work. So, as a takeaway, I think you kind of read it chapter by chapter and you can find individual things you can apply right away. And the more aggressive, more ambitious read is to try to do the holistic thing of all 10 steps. If you can figure that out and do it, and if you want to call for advice or if you want to use our help, that's what we do.
Excellent, David. Thank you so much. Truly invaluable lessons and insights you've shared with us. I'm super excited to share it with my team and my friends and people I respect. And I'm sure our members will be doing the same. So thank you for being here. And thank you, everybody, for dialing in. Hope to see all of you again very soon. Take care.
Okay, thanks.
Bye-bye.